Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is a podcast all about movies and TV shows that you have never seen. We are talking about the films that never made it to the screen, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
My name is Daniel Kaka.
My name is Adam Neediff.
Hello, Adam. Welcome to the show.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, it's a pleasure to have you as our first guest on this new podcast we're working on.
I am the first?
You are the first. Well, see, This is the rule. With anything we do on Pipe Dream Podcasts now, Adam has to be the first guest, because I believe you were the first other voice we brought on to the Weird Alphabet as well.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's true. It's either we sacrifice a lamb for the success of the show or
Get Adam on.
bring Adam on, which I think bringing Adam on is a much easier option here.
For anybody who is not familiar with the Weird Alphabet, you've been a voice on that show a couple of times. Adam is a game show expert and also very knowledgeable in 70s, 80s era talk show hosts and game show hosts. I ran into Adam a couple of months ago at a board game convention thing where Adam was running a game show thing, and I told Adam about this idea for a podcast that Dan and I wanted to do, and he said, "Oh, you have to talk about The Day the Clown Cried."
When you were talking about ideas that never made it, I figured that was just the quintessential example of it, at least from my realm of what I know in pop culture, and I'm sure...
somehow completely missed my mind. I had never heard that before. You know, everybody's got those blind spots, even in subjects that they know a ton about.
I've got a pretty big blind spot when it comes to movies, so I'm sure you guys were thinking of more obvious titles for it. But when you gave me this idea for, a movie that was never released or seen by the general public, that was my first frame of reference, was The Day the Clown Cried.
And you told me the whole spiel about it, and it was like, oh my goodness, this has to be something we need to have on. And of course, that means we have to have Adam on to help break it down with us.
Well, I'll do the best I can.
Well, Dan, for the rubes like me, how I was 3 months ago, what is The Day the Clown Cried?
You will see wonderful things happen to a human being because some things happen that make him think about others besides himself, and that's all I'm going to tell you.
So, The Day the Clown Cried, it was a Swedish-French film that was going to be directed, well, it was directed and starred Jerry Lewis. The original screenplay was by Joanne O'Brien and Charles Denton, with added and changed material by Jerry Lewis. It was about a circus clown who found himself in prison in a Nazi concentration camp. The film, we don't know if it's incomplete or not, but it was originally supposed to be released in 1973.
It is a very strange log line that you have there. Jerry Lewis doing this about a clown in Nazi Germany, and yeah.
I want to look into where Jerry Lewis was in his career. In 1971, Jerry Lewis was performing at the Olympia Theater. At that time, he was putting on a wildly successful show in that Paris theater. Like, he was doing sellout shows constantly throughout those 2 years. The show would include like a lot of comedy and music. That is when he met the producer, Nat Walshberger, who offered the opportunity to direct and star in his own movie. And then the production would be completely financed by Walshberger, his production company, and Europa Studios. Adam, from you, I want to know, Jerry Lewis, like, where did he come from and what kind of led him up to this moment in time? How did the general public know him?
Jerry Lewis really became a big star in the 1940s as part of the comedy team of Martin and Lewis. His partner was Dean Martin.
But you know, you're not dreaming. Scusa me, but you see, back in old Napoli.
Basically, Martin was the straight man of the act. He was a singer, and he was portrayed as kind of a ladies' man, and Jerry was this uncontrollable man-child. He acted like a big kid as part of the act, and Dean was trying to rein him in all the time.
Yeah.
And they were enormously successful, and then they had a very famous and very, very ugly falling out around 1956.
And I went to Dean and I said, look, we're not getting along now only because there's some undercurrent here where you would like to just step out and be acknowledged as an individual performer with talent, and you are. And I want to do some other things too. Let's just wrap it up.
And it's one of the most famous splits in show business because when an act splits up, they go their separate ways, they do different things, but eventually you can usually reunite the group for, one time only or something like that. And they were kind of like the Beatles. Once Martin and Lewis broke up, they never, ever got back together again. And there was a lot of speculation over the years about how their relationship was. Jerry Lewis maintained that they patched things up. And in fact, there's famous footage of Dean Martin making a surprise appearance that was orchestrated by Frank Sinatra during one of the Jerry Lewis muscular dystrophy telethons in the 1970s.
It seems like we haven't seen each other for 20 years.
Well, there was all those rumors about our breaking up, and then when I started the show and you weren't here, I believed it.
I think our generation would know Jerry best from those telethons every Labor Day weekend for years and years. But yeah, Jerry became a huge star in the 1940s, and up through the 1960s, he was pretty well known for broad slapstick, which is why I find it difficult to talk about him. I really, really hate when people try to analyze slapstick comedy, because if you ever watch documentaries about people who were famous for slapstick comedy, you'll always hear someone try to give some sort of depth to the work by saying, well, the brilliance of his work was the depth that he gave his characters, because deep down they wanted to be loved, and they conveyed that in the ways that the people around them couldn't bring themselves to understand. And then they show the footage, and the footage is the guy throwing water around and falling down a lot. And so, the frustrating thing about slapstick comedy is that nobody is willing to just say, it makes me laugh. There's no sin in that. I can't give you anything deeper than Jerry Lewis made people laugh. Jerry mugged for the camera and did pratfalls, and people laughed, and that's good on you if that makes you laugh. There's no reason to try to go into the science of it.
That reminds me a lot of the analogy of the literature teacher teaching her class about a scene, and she's analyzing the yellow blinds or the yellow shades, and she's like, it represents the sadness the character is experiencing. In the writer's head, she just made it yellow to make it goddamn yellow. That's it.
I was literally watching a video essay last night about director's cuts, and they had a clip of Orson Welles talking about Citizen Kane, and somebody was asking, what was the meaning of that cockatoo yelling in the middle of the film? It's just a shocking moment out of nowhere of just this cockatoo screech. And he said, oh yeah, I put that in there to wake the audience up.
If you ever watch old footage of Jerry, the funny thing about watching his stuff is there's a big disparity between movie Jerry and Jerry Lewis giving an interview. Basically, Jerry Lewis had two settings. He's either gallon of Mountain Dew or maudlin and mawkish.
The book starts out with the breakup of you and your partner.
Right.
Now, fairly traumatic. I know for a fact, according to the book.
We don't want to get heavy, Dave.
No. I'm getting to something here,
because,
I think.
certain things are tough to deal with.
No, it'll be all right. It'll be all right. What I wanted to ask you about was... Now, wait a minute. Look what you've done. You've missed the whole thing.
So, you watch the movie clips and whoa, lady! And then you'll watch him give some interview and it's Dean and I loved each other. That was the magic of our act. It was the love that we felt for each other. So that was where Jerry Lewis was from the 1940s to 1960s. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I didn't really appreciate until I was digging into this was Jerry's contribution to filmmaking. Jerry was one of the pioneers, I guess, of independent filmmaking. Jerry became very well known in the 1960s for kind of going out on his own and just kind of making the movies without any input from the movie studios. There was a movie that he did in the early 1960s called The Bellboy.
The Bellboy, filmed completely in fabulous Miami, where Bellboy Jerry turns the fantastic Fontainebleau Hotel into his own private madhouse.
Where he could not get any movie studio to agree to make this movie the way he wanted it done. So he just decided, okay, I'm going to make this movie by myself. And he found a hotel in Florida that agreed to provide the location for filming. And in exchange, Jerry agreed to finance the movie by performing nightly shows at the hotel while filming was in progress.
Oh, wow.
It was sellout shows every night, and he split the money, so Jerry was using his end of the money to finance the movie while the hotel was happy with the money they were making from having a nightly Jerry Lewis show at the hotel.
He's shooting all day and then going and doing a comedy act at night.
Wow.
That's got to be exhausting.
And that was how he financed the movie, and that gave him a lot of weight as a director, as a filmmaker, because movies aren't my wheelhouse. My wheelhouse is television, so this is all stuff that I've just learned in the past week reading up on Jerry. Mm-hmm. But Jerry pioneered a lot of techniques for filming comedy. One of the things that I guess Jerry was a pioneer in was making the way that the scene was shot part of the joke. He would do things with lenses. He would do things with the angles that the things were shot. Basically, instead of letting the joke stand by itself, he would find ways to make the filming of the scene work for the joke that he was going for.
Interesting.
So Jerry had a big contribution to directing film comedy.
I feel like my only exposure to Jerry Lewis in filmmaking is just when he played himself in King of Comedy.
Right, yeah. And in fact, his nickname was The Complete Filmmaker. Now, this next thing that I knew, 1971, Jerry released this book called The Total Filmmaker. What had happened was he'd given lectures about filmmaking at USC, and about 500 hours worth of his lectures at USC were assembled and turned into this manuscript.
First, of course, I'd like to have you meet the writer. And, of course, without the writer, there would be an overabundance of paper.
And Jerry's lecture covered every part of making a film. He gave lectures on writing, on directing, on casting, on how to negotiate a contract, on how to negotiate distribution.
Wow.
And for years and years and years, this book of Jerry Lewis's lectures at USC were used as a textbook for film schools because he got so thorough. So it was this odd thing where you had this broad slapstick comedian from the 50s and 60s, and he had emerged as the definitive authority on how to make a movie in the early 1970s as a result of this book.
It sounds as well like he's kind of like before independent movies were a thing, before Filmmaker Without a Crew, this is a guy who was trying to do it all on his own. He was trying to figure out the financing and the distribution and those aspects of filmmaking on his own, whether or not the studios were going to help him out with that.
Yeah. By the early 1970s, the way that he ended up in the movie, and this is kind of speculation on my part, but one of the things I picked up on was his movie career started to wane a bit in the late 1960s, right before he wrote this book. And you can kind of understand this. If you're famous for slapstick comedy, you definitely have kind of an expiration date to that, because nobody wants to see a guy in his 50s falling down staircases or, you know.
Yeah.
So Jerry knew that, you know, he was going to have to find something else to do. And also, I think every comedian that goes into film eventually just wants to do something serious, probably because they feel like they want to prove something to their audience and because they want to prove something to themselves.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We see that with, like, Jim Carrey's career.
Right. Eventually, Robin Williams does What Dreams May Come, or Bill Murray does Lost in Translation, or Adam Sandler does Reign Over Me. And I think Jerry Lewis had just hit that point. He wanted to prove something by doing a serious movie. Now, context for the time, at this point, the Holocaust had been completely untouched as a film subject. Because we were still decades away from Schindler's List. If you're familiar with documentaries, this was well before Shoah.
Yeah. I mean, World War II as a subject was all over the place, but definitely nobody was getting into the Holocaust.
I haven't had a chance to reach out to my parents or to my old teachers about this, but I'd be curious to know what the world's general feeling was about the Holocaust, like, say, in the late 1960s. I remember hearing once that the reason Roots was so groundbreaking at the time was because there was this big segment of the population that thought slavery should be forgotten about and buried and never mentioned again. And Roots was a triumph for people who were stepping forward and saying, no, this needs to be dealt with. And there's a Holocaust-centric episode of The Twilight Zone where Rod Serling finishes up with a monologue about how he believed concentration camps should be left standing as kind of a permanent reminder that this stuff happened. So I imagine there was a similar debate going on between the people who thought the Holocaust needed to be put away and not talked about, and people that said, no, we need to deal with this.
I forget who the film critic was, but there was a critic out there who said that with this movie, with Jerry Lewis, that had he done this maybe 10 years later, it would have been released. It would have been probably a much better film, and the public might have been ready for something like this.
Forgive me, what year again was this that he was working on it?
I was going through newspaper archives to try to put together the beginnings of this. The absolute earliest mention I could find in print was a January 1966 newspaper column. It's an entertainment reporter's column. Paul Mart Productions has purchased the script The Day the Clown Cried. Filming is scheduled for April in Europe.
But this is very much before Easy Rider and the new Hollywood definitions of the 70s.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is in the late 1960s. And then a year later, I stumbled upon, and this really surprised me, a newspaper profile of Milton Berle. Milton Berle was a comedian similar to Jerry Lewis in the sense that he came up in the later days of vaudeville and was also known for very, very broad comedy. And he was the first big TV superstar with Texaco Star Theater in the late 1940s. And he mentions that he's just signed a contract to do 2 films for Columbia. And one of them is, he says he's negotiating to do a serious movie. And one of the scripts that he's looking at for his serious movie is a screenplay called The Day the Clown Cried. So Milton Berle was considering doing this movie in 1967, which, by the way, is the one thing I believe that could have made this worse than the movie that it ended up being. He is the one choice that would have been worse than what happened.
There were 2 other actors that were offered these as well.
Yeah, I was reading up on this. What I saw was Dick Van Dyke also.
Yep, I saw Bobby Darin and I saw Dick Van Dyke.
Yeah. Dick Van Dyke, I think, would have made this work. Number one, I don't see him rewriting the screenplay, which I have a feeling that a lot of the problems had to do with the screenplay being altered by Jerry Lewis. Yes. I have a feeling Dick Van Dyke wouldn't have done this, and I believe Dick Van Dyke might have been able to pull this off if any actor could.
Do you have anything else on the timeline of what you found down before, like, we even got into casting and stuff?
Well, the strange thing is, after this 1967 thing with Milton Berle, nothing happens for 4 years. The next mention I can find in print is 1971, and by 1971, the next mention of the movie that I found is Jerry Lewis has agreed to sign on to star and direct, and I am sure that directing was the crucial part of this deal for him, because Jerry by that point had his total filmmaker reputation, and yeah. If he can pull this off, this would be the ultimate feather in the cap. I am sure, if you can imagine what this would do to a performer's ego, somebody who has been primarily known for comedy gets this screenplay where he is going to play a comic who is in the midst of the Holocaust. To be very cynical about this, I'm sure that Jerry Lewis saw Oscars dancing in front of his eyes when he saw this screenplay. Because, this is Oscar bait.
I did find a quote from Jerry Lewis because he was definitely hesitant on taking on a script like that. And I do understand, like, the Oscar bait thing. Although, were the Oscars really known for being, like, ultra heavy and depressing like it is today? Or is it... For a long while, like, the Oscars were dominated by musicals. And musicals were getting Best Picture.
That's a good point, yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think they really made that turn. Or they might have been. I don't know. I'd have to look through the history of the Oscars. But...
In the 60s, we've got Best Picture winners, The Apartment, West Side Story, Lawrence of Arabia, Tom Jones, My Fair Lady, Sound of Music, Man for All Seasons, In the Heat of the Night, Oliver, Midnight Cowboy was 69. There's a lot of big, grand stories like Lawrence of Arabia. You do have your musicals like Sound of Music and My Fair Lady and West Side Story. But you do have Midnight Cowboy in 1969, which is that, darker human story. So I could definitely see it starting to turn around to being like, this is a thing that could get me Oscars. And if you got Midnight Cowboy in 1969, Patton in 1970, I think you are kind of painting a picture for bleak historical dramas could be something that people will give awards to.
After he read the script, like, quoting him, he said, "The thought of playing Helmut, who was the clown, still scared the hell out of me." He didn't seem like he was all gung-ho at first.
I mean, absolutely. I'm sure if you're a rational human being, you can see both sides of this when the movie is offered to you. So for all the talk about Oscar bait, there's definitely a side that I'm sure where you read the screenplay, and you can also be thinking, boy, if one thing in this movie's execution goes wrong.
Something that we have not mentioned, though, that we really need to consider is Jerry Lewis was Jewish.
Yeah.
It felt for him like he is kind of the right person to tell this story because of his heritage.
So the movie was everything you could offer Jerry. It's his first drama, and he gets to direct it, and he gets the starring role, and it's something that's culturally important to him to a degree. I have to say there was buzz about this movie from what I'm seeing. There's a clip on YouTube of Jerry as a guest on the Dick Cavett show, and an audience member asks Jerry when the movie is going to come out.
I beg your pardon?
The Day the Clown Cried. When does your next movie open? The lady from the studio wants to know.
The Day the Clown Cried will be I hopefully will finish cutting it the next 6 or 7 weeks. And we've been invited to the Cannes Film Festival, so I think we will open it then in May. Then it'll be released in America.
Throughout newspapers in 1971, you see just these constant little mentions of it. There's never insights, there's never details. Throughout 1971, you just see these mentions in entertainment columns that Jerry Lewis is making this movie called The Day the Clown Cried, and it's going to be his first dramatic role. And you see it everywhere in print in 1971, and then after 1971, the movie just quietly disappears from the press.
That's kind of like Smile from Brian Wilson.
Yeah.
Dan, do you have any information about, like, what the production was like, or the pre-production and everything, the behind the scenes of putting this film together?
Yeah. Even though he was hesitant at first, he did end up signing on to do the production. Although before going on to do so, he had to go back to Las Vegas to finish out one more month at Caesar's Palace to fulfill his contract with the hotel. He agreed to make the film, but wanted to make some changes to the script in order to make him feel more comfortable with the material. We'll go into those changes later on, and I feel like those changes really hindered this movie from releasing, and I'll explain that later. But in February of 1972, he toured the concentration camps at Auschwitz and Dachau, shot the exteriors of the buildings in Paris, and was reworking the script even further. Also, while doing that, he lost 35 pounds through the grapefruit diet.
Oh, wow.
And I looked into like when the grapefruit diet started. That was like the 1920s is when they figured that out. But yeah, he lost a tremendous amount of weight in order to play this role. Principal photography then began in April of 1972 in Sweden. Right away, the production was a mess. Equipment was either lost or delivered late to their location. The money that Washburger promised was not anywhere to be found. And then on top of that, he never even showed up on set.
Wait, who is it that didn't show up on set?
Nat Washburger. So that was everything leading up into the filming, but I'm not sure, Adam, if you want to add anything to what may have happened prior to or during filming.
During filming, I can't really speak to you beyond what you've just said. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I do want to point out that's rather interesting is footage of this movie has surfaced.
Oh.
Oddly enough, there was a German documentary crew that made a documentary about the making of this movie some years back, and they got Jerry Lewis to cooperate with it, and somehow, despite the fact that Jerry didn't want the movie seen, and despite the fact that this movie, as far as we know, remains hidden, they somehow got their hands on about 28 minutes of it. So if you go looking for it, there's about 28 minutes of this movie out there.
I've also seen the script being posted online. I'm not sure how accurate those scripts are or if they're the official scripts or not.
Well, the 28 minutes that's out there is peculiar. Mm-hmm. You very briefly touched on this, but the first sign that I think that there's something wrong in this movie is a change that Jerry Lewis made to the script. In the original screenplay, the main character's name, the clown's name, is Carl Schmidt, which is sort of a German everyman name. Jerry Lewis rewrites the screenplay, and in the new screenplay, and in the finished product in the movie, the main character's name is Helmut Dork.
Jeez.
There are exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, a wacky name for the main character is a red flag. A wacky name is a very, very red flag when you're doing a movie about the Holocaust. Now, the way this movie plays out is it's called The Day the Clown Cried, but the 28 minutes of surviving footage of this movie is just, it's the lifetime that the clown cried. The entire movie from the snippets we're seeing is just the world crapping on him.
Yeah.
It's just very hard to watch because the first thing that we see in this 28 minutes of surviving footage is Helmut and another clown walk out to take the stage at a circus, and for some reason the stands are empty, which would lead you to think that this is supposed to be a rehearsal. I hope that's the idea, but then the next thing that happens in the surviving footage is strange. Helmut trips and falls down during his entrance, and he's holding on to another clown, and the other clown falls over because of the trip. The other clown does a big fall, and he lets out a big laugh. And if you see this, you would think, oh, this is part of the act, this is on purpose. But then the next scene is Helmut looking morose, while his boss scolds him for ruining the show. So it's this empty circus, and a clown did a pratfall and laughed, and somehow this is a big, big failure. And then after the scolding, you see Helmut sitting at his mirror, and he takes off his makeup. And this is one of those scenes where you can imagine somebody sitting at their typewriter and pounding this out and nodding and thinking, oh yeah, this is good stuff. If you've ever seen Emmett Kelly, Emmett Kelly was famous for having a hobo clown look, and he had a sad frown painted onto his face as part of his makeup. And so Jerry has the Emmett Kelly style sad clown makeup. And he's removing the makeup and sitting in front of the mirror, and he's removing the mirror. We see that he's actually frowning. So you see, his pain isn't just a show. That's what we learned from that. The sadness on his face is actually mirroring what's within him.
Huh. I once worked on a student film that had that exact same scene in it.
Oh. So he goes home to his movie wife, and it's one of those movie wives who exists only to reassure him that he's talented and embrace him while he pours his heart out. Then we have another scene that's odd because there are two ways to interpret the scene as you're watching it. And to be fair, again, this is 28 minutes out of a 2-hour movie, so there's no way of knowing what they were going for. But it's hard to read this scene because what we've hammered home in the first few minutes of the found footage is that he's a failure at a clown and people think that he's not very good at it. So after this pep talk, we see him performing his circus act. And the first part of his circus act is that he tries to light a cigarette, but every time he holds his cigarette towards the light, the flame goes out and he mugs at the camera. And then the next bit of his act is he throws a paper airplane, and you hear a sound effect of a crash, and he kneels down at a pile of ashes, so it looks like the paper airplane has crashed. And then he juggles, and the gag is more balls come down than he threw up into the air. So his entire act is built around things going wrong for him, which that could be his act, or it could be a really, really wrong way of showing the audience that he's not a very good clown.
That seems like a very confusing, misleading... Yeah, because he's supposed to be awful, but like when I was looking through the summary, they said that he used to be a famous clown that toured with the Ringling Brothers. So he used to be an accomplished clown before that, and then he's just kind of washed up at this point in his life.
So it's very, very strange the way he's presented. And then the next scene is him at a bar talking about suicide. He makes derogatory remarks about Hitler, which is how he gets arrested and thrown into a concentration camp as a political prisoner. It's hard to look at because just the entire movie is this guy getting dumped on.
Yeah.
There's no relief from this. There's no release valve. And even, we now have the definitive Holocaust movie, I think, which is Schindler's List. And even Schindler's List turns a release valve. You have a scene where he swindles the Nazis in a card game with a high-stakes gamble that pays off for him. You have the scene where, some of the workers in his factory get together and they get one of the men in the factory really, really drunk until he's knocked out, and then they pull his gold tooth to make a ring. So there are these little release valves that Schindler's List gives you, so the movie just doesn't feel like you're having this unloaded on.
Yeah. A lot of the conversations that you have with Oskar Schindler and I can't remember the name of the character who's helping him, but like there's a lot of light levity in those.
Yeah, so I mean, you get the full weight of it. You see how tragic and how distressing this chapter of history was. But still, they give you these little releases so you can tolerate it and keep going with the story.
You feel that more as well. If it's a constant onslaught of depression, then you're not going to have a moment to, reset your brain and to be able to feel it again. You're just going to become numb to it.
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of the problem. Again, it's hard to judge it from 28 minutes, but that's the thing that gets me is just in the 28 minutes of existing footage, there's no happiness. Even the scenes where he's entertaining the kids, because that's the function that he's eventually given in the camp. The guards kind of see a role they can give him in the camp where he's in charge of entertaining the children. The end of the movie is there is a tragic payoff to this plan for him to entertain the children. But you see him looking really, really sad and looking really, really distressed every time he goes over to entertain the kids. And there's another scene where the guards just beat the hell out of him while the kids are watching. So, I mean, it's every possible horrible thing you can possibly have happen to this character.
Yeah, it seems like with him going into the concentration camp then, like, he's gone from a shitty situation to a worse situation. And even, like, if you started off with him being happy at first, like, then you have something that he's hopeful for. Whereas if you have him in a bar talking about suicide and then him getting arrested to go to a concentration camp, I mean, why not just give up?
This, again, speaks to the changes that Jerry Lewis made to the screenplay. As I understand it, the original screenplay was more of a redemption arc, where Carl Schmidt, the original clown, was, in the words of the screenwriter, just a total bastard who basically tells on friends and names names to get them arrested as a way of protecting himself when the Nazis are originally started to round people up. And then he ends up in the camp, and the story that they were going for was when he sees what he's done to his friends and what he's subjecting them to, the scenes in the camp are supposed to be his redemption arc, where he rights all the wrongs that he's created. Instead, Jerry Lewis has turned it into just this lugubrious movie about a miserable, miserable man who is made more miserable.
Yeah, he basically turned this into a woe is me. Definitely the first act is where a lot of the heavy changes were made. And it seemed like after he established that character, he's like, okay, this is how I want everyone to portray me. And he just kind of left everything as is. Well, he first started entertaining people in the camps. He got beaten up by the guards, and then he was thrown outside where he noticed the children were on the other side of the camp. And I know Jerry Lewis was trying to emulate, there's like a lot of famous photos of like the prisoners at these concentration camps just like lined up along the fence, and these children like lined up against the fence, and that's what he was trying to create, was that image of the children lined up against the fence while he's trying to entertain them and trying to give them some sort of hope and some sort of happiness. I can see why like the studios were going after comedians to fulfill this role, even with such a heavy subject. Having them being able to make a genuine laugh in such an awful situation, it makes sense why they would gravitate towards comedians to fulfill that. Like you mentioned before, that the end of the movie, the way he gets tricked into performing for the Nazis, for the guards there, is that once they find out that the children kind of follow everything that he does and watches his every move, they agree that he will get a fair trial in order to get out of the concentration camp if he leads the children into the showers or into the gas chambers at the end of the movie.
Yeah, so that's the bargain he's been offered. And one of the surviving scenes of the movie is the Nazis laying out their grand plan, which is we need to kill children because if they grow up to be adults who have memories of this, then they're not going to be obedient. And we need only citizens who are obedient, so we need to get rid of the children. Yeah. Helmut Dork, thinking of himself at that point, agrees to go along with the plan, and then the ending of the movie, kind of the implication that I guess they're indicating in the screenplay is Helmut thinks there's a miracle coming, or he's hoping that there will be. There's going to be something that bails everybody out at the last minute. It's Helmut waiting for some good to come of this, waiting for some answer to a prayer that's going to rescue the kid so he doesn't have to go through with this. And the end of the movie is he does his job and he walks the kids into the gas chambers, and the last kid that walks into the gas chamber just looks up at him and she gives him a big, big smile, and he smiles back at her, and he just takes her by the hand and they walk into the gas chamber together. So the implication of the movie is Helmut just decides, the gravity of it suddenly hits him, and he realizes that he's killed these kids to save his own life, and he's decided he can't live with that, so he just goes in with them.
It is bleak.
Yeah, that's
But it's also bleak in that weird way where you're like not sure what you're trying to say with this movie. Like, bleak movies should have some sort of a point to them, and I'm not really sure what the message of this film is supposed to be other than this is a bad time for everybody.
I mean, again, this was the first time anyone had attempted to really make a movie about it, so obviously there was no template to work from. But it missed the mark, and again, making that judgment based on an incomplete cut of the film, again, basing it on 28 minutes worth of footage. Maybe we would feel differently if we saw the whole thing, but then that leads to the next part of the story, which is the reputation that this has gained over the decades since the film was finished without being released.
Yeah.
Well, before all this started, Jerry Lewis did have a lot of questions for Nat Washburger, and he has actually been quoted in saying, "Why don't you try to get Sir Laurence Olivier? I mean, he doesn't find it too difficult to choke to death playing Hamlet. My bag is comedy, Mr. Washburger. You're asking me if I'm prepared to deliver helpless kids into a gas chamber? Oh, so some laugh. How do I pull that off?" So that's an interesting attitude, like leading into it, where like just that conversation alone should have been like red flags going off in Jerry Lewis's head, but for some reason he kept on going.
I've talked about why this would be appealing to his ego, but you can tell even from the beginning, it sounds like he had buyer's remorse about signing on for this.
Yeah.
Because you were mentioning before that he was an independent filmmaker before this. And I think it would be appealing that a producer came to him and said, hey, instead of you financing your own movies like you've been doing before, we're going to give you complete creative freedom and we're going to foot the bill. We're going to pay for it. And for him, I believe that's the perfect scenario for him.
Oh, yeah. And again, that goes back to the total filmmaker reputation. I mean, you can't be that successful without developing some sort of ego. Rob Schneider, I remember after Roger Ebert died, and Roger Ebert had written a very, very famous bad review of Deuce Bigalow 2. And Rob Schneider wrote an essay about how terrible, terrible movies get made. He said one of the sentences that leads to every bad movie is, well, you'll make this good. And I'm sure as many red flags and as many worries as Jerry Lewis had, his own track record at this point would make him think, I can make this work. So I can understand his own instincts betraying him. I can understand his ego leading him to think, you know what, I'll make this work.
Once they filmed everything, or at least when they're in the middle of filming things. So it turns out Washburger had actually run out of money. He actually ran out of money due to his last production on The Lamb. So he had paid writer Joanne O'Brien initially for the script, which was $5,000 for the script, and then she was going to be paid an additional $50,000 when the movie actually went into production. She never saw a dime of that money. So right away, she's pissed. She's angry. Like, if someone owes you $50,000, I'd be angry as well. Jerry Lewis, he ended up spending $2 million of his own money to finish shooting and editing this film. So that's understandably why he was angry about this too. Even with the completion of the film, those who were involved with the film could not agree on the final cut of the film to allow it to be released, which is why I feel like there's so many unfinished portions of this film that are out there. And I'm guessing the 28 minutes that may have been released may have been the part of the movie where they said, we don't want this part in it, and if you just leave that part out and reshoot it, then everything else will be fine. So maybe they're trying to work with that. I don't know. I'm speculating on that first 28 minutes.
Even with Jerry Lewis agreeing to do an interview towards the end of his life about it, there's still no total agreement on how the movie didn't get released. Yeah. Harry Shearer, who was one of the most vocal people about this movie, because Harry Shearer is one of the few people who has seen a finished cut. Mm-hmm. And for a long time, he's been the definitive authority on it because he has actually sat down and given interviews about what he saw when he saw the movie.
Yeah, I actually have the exact quote from him. Yeah, so he did the interview for Spy Magazine in May of 1992. So if you don't know Harry Shearer, he's probably most known for his roles in The Simpsons. So whenever you hear Skinner, that's Harry Shearer right there. But he had this to say, with most of these kinds of things, you find that the anticipation or the concept is better than the thing itself. But seeing this film was really awe-inspiring in that you are rarely in the presence of a perfect object. This was a perfect object. This movie was so drastically wrong. Its pathos and its comedy are so wildly misplaced that you could not, in your fantasy of what might be like, improve on what really is. Oh my God, that's all I have to say.
So Harry Shearer has spoken to the quote-unquote quality of the film. Mm-hmm. Allegedly, he was given a cut of the film by somebody who was attached to Jerry via the annual Labor Day Telethon. One of the other things, if you go to YouTube, you'll find an interview where he's talking to Howard Stern, and he says, allegedly, one of the reasons the movie was never released was because somehow the Iranian government was involved in funding for the film, and assets got seized.
He had Iranian money.
Iranian?
Yes, and that when the Shah was deposed in 1979, Iranian assets were seized at one point. And among those assets, because they paid for the movie, was the negative of the film, and that's why it's in it.
No, I don't buy that one.
You don't like that one?
I don't like that one.
Was hijacked.
The movie's
about Iranian women.
Now, that's a speculated reason. There's also speculation that Jerry Lewis was ashamed of it and pulled some sort of power play with his contract that allowed him to prevent it from being released.
Yeah.
There's another theory that basically you're touching on, because people didn't get paid, it was locked up in purgatory until all the issues were dealt with in court. Mm-hmm. So we still have not really zeroed in, as far as I know, on the reason that it was never released. We just know that it never got released.
The one factor that I was finding a lot, it had to do with Joanne O'Brien, because she actually watched the cut. The reason for the film not being released is mostly because of the two original writers, Joanne O'Brien and Charles Denton. After O'Brien watched the rough cut, she called it a disaster, quote. What Jerry Lewis changed was so drastic to the initial intent. The first thing Lewis did was change the name of the character, which we talked about before. In the original script, Schmidt was an arrogant, self-centered clown who, according to Bryan, was a real bastard. Yeah, he tried using his wife, who knew the ringmaster, to get him a gig. After he got arrested, he started ratting out all of his friends, and it became a redemption story, whereas Lewis, he wanted this to be more of his great dictator, and had Washburger not given the rights to Lewis, he probably would not have been able to make those drastic changes.
Now, here's the interesting thing. In 1982, Jerry releases an autobiography. We were talking about speculated reasons. I would say the one about O'Brien holds the most weight, and Jerry seems to indicate in his autobiography that is the reason. But here's a paragraph from Jerry's autobiography where he addresses this. As of now, The Day the Clown Cried has not yet been released. It sits in Stockholm, tied up in litigation. Until the courts finally decide on the merits of Joan O'Brien's and my case against the producer, the film stays there under lock and key. The last 3 scenes are all I'm holding. They're my protection. Fortunately, though, the story is timeless. I can release it 10 years from now, and it will still hold up. That passage I find interesting, because it sounds like even in 1982, Jerry still was proud of this and still wanted it to be seen. There were times when he would tell interviewers not to ask him about the film, and then there was an audience Q&A where somebody in the audience in the early 2000s was brave enough to ask about, hey, Jerry, are we ever going to see The Day the Clown Cried? And Jerry, 20 years after writing this passage in his autobiography, says, no, you will never see it because it's a bad, bad film and I'm ashamed of it.
I had actually found that same footage as well, because it seemed like he was so gung-ho about this movie for so long, and I felt like he was still trying to hang on to it, but when I saw that, it was like, that felt like the nail in the coffin for him to say, like,
it'll never be seen. Sorry. I'll tell you how it ends.
I think it's Janeane Garofalo who said this. I know I've come across a comedian talking on this, and a theory was expressed, and I took notes on this, going through Jerry's obituaries. There's something, and I'll come back to the theory here in just a moment, but this is from one of Jerry's obituaries. He became increasingly known for his misanthropy, misogyny, and problematic humor. In 2007, he apologized after pointing to a cameraman during the live muscular dystrophy telethon and referring to him as a homophobic slur. He was also known for racist and misogynistic remarks throughout his comedy routines in his later career. This included a 2000 incident in which he disparaged the work of Lucille Ball, stating that, quote, a woman doing comedy doesn't offend me but sets me back a bit. I think of her as a producing machine that brings babies into the world.
Wow.
So, Jerry was a man of ego uncontained who said things and believed things like that. Yeah. And there's a certain level of stardom where people are afraid to speak up against you, and we've certainly seen proof of that in recent years. And then there comes a point where when you're on the downside of your career, people are willing to speak up more and more.
Yeah.
And by the 1990s, Jerry was aware that people did not like him. And this is the thing where I think I'm quoting Janeane Garofalo, but I don't remember for certain. But basically the theory was Jerry became aware at some point in his life that people were waiting for this movie with their talons out. Yeah. They were waiting to see The Day the Clown Cried just to see it for themselves and to be able to comment on it. And I think that's when it began to sink in that, this might not be something that I should be proud of.
Yeah.
Interesting. So maybe like that flip did not happen because he actually thought it was bad, but because so many other people said it was bad.
Because it had developed a reputation at that point, and because Jerry's ego had been penetrated enough that he was aware that there was a large segment of people that didn't like him. And especially now, show business had changed to the point where people in power didn't like him.
Wow.
So I think that may have been what changed his tune. Okay. Now, that brings us to speculation of if the film will ever be seen, because Jerry had said, his wording was fairly specific. He said, you will not see it in my lifetime. The rumor right now is that he gave a finished cut of the movie to the Library of Congress with the provision that they have to sit on it until 2024 before they do anything with it.
Yes.
We may see this film in our lifetimes.
It's very possible, although there are a few other details in that, is that they need to get permission from the Lewis estate, which I imagine that they more than likely would allow that to happen just because, I mean, it's money for them easily. But there was a New York Times report that was done in December of 2018 that reported that the print that was given to the Library of Congress is not actually the complete film.
Wow.
Oh, interesting.
The idea of like a lot of this footage being hung up by people in Iran, our investors in Iran, might actually be true. So who knows? Something that I wanted to touch on before we start wrapping up on everything, just because I realized I missed this. While he was doing a lot of these press conferences, he also threw Washburger under the bus, saying that he did not meet his financial duties. And then Washburger eventually countersued him for defamation for stating that and saying that, no, I do have money. I am paying for the production. But I feel like that's where a lot of legal things may have got mixed up there too. David, you really inspired me when we went over the American IT crowd and really looking into producers, because producers are an interesting character when it comes to creating these movies, and you kind of get a sense of who that person is by seeing what type of movies that they produce. And I noticed that for Nat Washburger, in his career, towards the end of his career, he produced the movie Starcrash.
You must sail to the haunted stars. Find the Count's secret planet and destroy it.
This is at the time that Star Wars was really popular, and this was one of David Hasselhoff's first movies. And it is a wild ride. Oh, wait, he did the screenplay for that? I didn't know that. Nat Washburger actually did some of the screenplay for this movie. But it is one of those movies that was featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000, the reboot.
Oh.
Literally.
Wow.
Yeah. It is a fascinating film to watch.
So the guy who produced Day the Clown Cried went on to do the great Starcrash.
Yes. It's interesting for
Interesting.
Sure. And he wrote it, which is nuts. Like, I mean, he created the story for one, but it looked like that's his only screenplay credit is Starcrash.
What more do you need? If we do see this movie in our lifetimes, what are you expecting from it? What would you expect this to be?
I'm going to guess that it is probably going to be pretty bad, but probably not as bad as its reputation makes it seem like.
I kind of agree with you, because even Harry Shearer, who has said, no, it's worse than you're expecting, even saying that inflates it even more. I think the people who are waiting to see this movie are expecting it to be Plan 9 from outer space, except with the Holocaust. And I think ultimately what it is, it's just going to be a not particularly good movie.
Yeah. And, I don't think it'll be bad in an interesting way.
Right.
Yeah.
When I first heard about this from you, I think you mentioned that quote. It was like, this is bad in every conceivable way that it could be bad. That, every aspect of this movie is terrible. And the thing is that, fun bad movies, even when they're terrible in every aspect, there's still, some sort of charm there.
There's some sort of redeeming quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whether it's, the insanity of a figure like Tommy Wiseau or Ed Wood, something like that, there's something to hold on to, but it doesn't sound like there's something to hold on to as much with this. Because even for Jerry Lewis, it sounds like he was excited about it, but it doesn't sound like it's a passion project.
Yeah. This film, I feel like, is going against the grain a lot of what Jerry Lewis was used to, and I think he may have been having to stop himself from going all out or going into, I guess, full comedian mode in this sense, which is what he's performed his whole life. So I feel like he's working against himself constantly, where we're not going to watch this movie and think, well, if it's so bad it's good, like it's Jerry Lewis, he's going to find some ways to entertain us. No, I think this is Jerry Lewis trying to find in every way how to make us compassionate for the character and how to make us feel sad. And I feel like a lot of that is going to come off as something that we just cringe at. And I feel like we're just going to feel so uncomfortable watching this movie.
I always like to imagine how would the world be different, if it would be different at all, if this movie was released, when it was made and when it was supposed to in the early 70s. For one, it sounds like Jerry Lewis's career might have been affected, although I don't know how much it would have been affected.
Yeah, again, you touched on pretty much, I would say, the best-known movie of his later career, which was The King of Comedy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
His career was starting to trickle away as far as film was concerned around this point anyway, so it really would not have inhibited things that much.
Yeah, because he was already kind of stopping to do things anyways.
Yeah. So it would have had an effect, but it wouldn't have ruined anything. It wouldn't have ended his career. And I think had the movie come out in 1973, it would become a thing where you look back on it 20 to 30 years later as kind of an oddity. Here's this weird movie that Jerry Lewis did years back.
Yeah, I think it would have been buried.
Yeah.
I mean, it does make me think about, the Hollywood of that era, the new Hollywood conversation of the dark, gritty movies of the 70s that, were the most popular movies and that were getting all the awards, and the Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, if you've ever read that book, that's just all about this era. And I think there's a lot of people now who look at this being one of the best era of films. With the movies that came out, you gotta wonder what that conversation would be like if there was also this thrown in there that was trying to do the same thing, but did it totally wrong. And if that would color the conversation at all. Although probably not, because I bet you there were just as many terrible films that came out during this era that we've just all forgotten about.
Yeah. We are in the golden age of television right now, but even still, now there is garbage television.
That is very true. Is there anything that you think that could have made this movie good, or made it successful, made it something that would have been proud to have come out? It sounds like if Jerry Lewis hadn't tampered with it, it probably would have been a much better film.
I would say today you could probably do something with it, because now we have something to work with. Hollywood now knows how to deal with subject matter like this.
Yeah.
And I think today, and you certainly mentioned the name earlier, Jim Carrey, I think an actor like that has certainly proven that he could at least give this the old college try. It's in the presentation. It has nothing to do with the idea. It's, as Roger Ebert said, it's not what the movie is about, it's how it is about it. So you can take any premise and make a movie out of it. So there's nothing about the premise of this movie that rules out making a good one. It's just having the right people and being able to trust them to do their jobs well and present it in a sensitive way. So I believe this or any other movie is workable.
Well, the whole thing also sounds so much to me like The Great Dictator. And I know that was mentioned earlier. This is the comedy actor who wants to do his own thing and do something serious, although I believe Chaplin's motivations were different. I don't think he saw it as a way to elevate himself, because at the time, comedians doing anything serious was absolutely unheard of.
I thought he was doing it to separate himself from the Hitler look that he was now sporting, that Hitler originally copied from him.
He made that before Hitler was enemy number one in the eyes of history. He made that before, the final solution was enacted in Nazi Germany. Back when there were still plenty of people in America who were like, what's going on over there isn't that big of a deal. We don't really need to worry about it. And he made this movie in a time saying, no, this is a problem. Hitler is a bad guy, and we need to start waking up to this. And that was so much more the motivation for making that movie. And, that again was made before we had a playbook of ways to make a movie about this. That movie wasn't necessarily as much about the Holocaust, but it dealt with a lot of that pre-Holocaust stuff of moving Jewish communities into the ghettos and everything like that. But it's just interesting when you think about how that movie does it right. I think one of the biggest things that it does right is that the main character, whose name now escapes me, but the guy who looks like Hitler and does the speech as him at the end, because Chaplin's playing that dual role in that movie. But, like, he is a completely redeemable character all throughout. So we're experiencing these atrocities through his eyes. And I think that's, like, the big thing is that it sounds like The Day the Clown Cried originally was intended to be seeing the horrors of this event through this very innocent person's eyes. But when you rope in all of the weird character nonsense that Jerry Lewis was adding, that's when it kind of falls apart, because you have all this other baggage. He's no longer an audience surrogate. Go watch The Great Dictator, everybody.
Yeah.
I was not expecting this. I mean, I guess I should have been prepared for this, knowing, like, the subject matter of the movie. I thought there would be a little bit more lightheartedness to the story of how, you know, a story of Hollywood ego. But really, it's just sad that this whole thing happened.
Yeah, it's thinking about it now, I suddenly realize there's no comfortable way to get out of a discussion about something like this. Do you have a sponsor plug that you want to tie into this discussion? Helmut Dork, the circus clown, was such a failure that he didn't know where to go to get quality eyeglasses at a great, great price. At myeyeglasses.com.
Adam, how could you ever think that we would be important enough to be sponsored?
Someday.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for coming on to the show with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the rest of the series.
Yeah, I am too. Do you have anything that you would want to plug? Anything you have going on that anybody can go check out?
Yeah, if you do a search for my name, ADAM, last name NEDEFF. I'm on Amazon, and if you want to read some books about the history of game shows, by golly, I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah, lots of excellent books about game shows, game show hosts, the history of all that. I know you were talking about what you're working on now that I'm very excited for, just because I like weird math problems.
A biography of Monty Hall is on the way, is what David's saying.
Yeah. So definitely everybody should go check that out. Thank you again so much. If anybody wants to find more about this podcast, we're going to be on pipedreampodcasts.com, where you can find other stories, wacky misadventures of people trying to make movies and failing. Check all that out on pipedreampodcast.com, where you can also find other podcasts like this. We would also love to receive emails from you. You can send those emails to notgetmade@gmail.com. Talk to us about movies that you would love us to cover or things that we may have missed. This show is as much about us learning about these stories as it is talking about them. So anything that you have to share, we would love to hear.
You can also connect with us on Twitter at HGTNGM or on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made?
And that's going to be the end of the show for us this week. Thank you all so much for listening.
Sure thing.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
If you call her your pet, though she's shaped like spaghetti, that's amore.
That's amore. Bells will ring.
Ting-a-ling-a-ling, ting-a-ling-a-ling.
You sing Vita Bella.
Vita Bella, Vita Bella.